as a former energy regulator, I'm actually excited by the terrific turnout for today's webinar. While some people may view network tariff design as a somewhat dull backwater of utility regulation, it's now becoming clear that rate design for all energy services, including networks, is crucial to the success of the coming energy transition. If we're going to have smart grids, end-use consumers need to see the costs and benefits of their consumption choices. For this, we need smart tariffs to deliver the right price signals, to encourage efficient consumption, to integrate renewables, and to support electrification to displace fossil emissions. Flat rate network tariffs are just not good enough. Our presenters today will shed light on smart tariff designs and their benefits for European consumers and power grids. Now, I'd like to turn to a couple of logistical points. Please take a look at the questions pane on your webinar control panel, as shown on the slide here. We hope you will use this pane to submit your questions for the presenters in the Q&A session after their initial brief presentation. And in addition, I'd like everybody to know that we're recording the webinar, and we're going to send out links to the recording and the slide deck in the next day or so. With that quick introduction, now let me introduce our energy experts. We have two speakers today. Christos Kolokathis anchors RAP's power team in Brussels. He brings his expertise to issues of rate design, regional energy markets, electric transport, and market design. Before joining RAP, Christos worked for the UK's national regulator, Ofgem, leading projects to monitor security of supply and advising policymakers on the UK's capacity market. He also has worked on European power issues as an expert at the Energy Center of the Netherlands. Andreas Jahn is the second speaker, is the backbone of RAP's work in Germany. Andreas focuses on the issues around both the German and the European energy transition, including tariff design, energy efficiency, efficiency financing mechanisms, and grid regulation. Before joining RAP, Andreas was the regulatory director for the German electricity and gas provider, Lecker Energy, a senior expert for the Association of New Energy Suppliers, and a member of the task force at the Ministry of Economics on grid regulation in Germany. He has extensive knowledge in energy policy, political decision-making, and legislative process. Christos and Andreas, over to you now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Richard, and thanks to everyone for joining today's webinar. So what we will demonstrate today is that public policy should help the energy transition instead of impeding it. And effective network tariff design is one of the key tools to achieve the European transition goals to a clean, affordable, and reliable power system. In this first slide, in this first graph, we see the power system of the past. On the one end, we have large centralized power stations which generate electricity, which then flows through the transmission and distribution network to the final consumers. And in this next graph, we see the transforming power system with significant deployment of renewable energy like wind and PVs, demand response, EVs, and other smart technologies. And what smart tariff can do is it can help us to meet the challenges of integrating renewables and electric vehicles and optimize the use of our networks. And there is a very good piece of news here in that currently our networks are, broadly speaking, underutilized, and there is scope for shifting loads around and make best use of them and save costs for all consumers. But before getting into the details of smart tariff design, I would like to spend a few minutes to discuss what are we talking about, what are the network costs and tariffs, and define the scope of this webinar. So again, in this slide, we see the transforming power system, and basically what we mean by network cost is the costs for the power lines and for any other assets and services that will enable delivery of power to the consumers. And broadly speaking, this can be split into two categories: investment costs and operational costs, where the bulk of this is for investment costs. And for today's webinar, we're going to focus on the shared infrastructure, so the parts highlighted by the red and blue circles in the graph. And I should also mention here that tariffs is network tariffs, or in other words, the retail tariffs for network costs are the way that consumers pay for these network costs. So why network charge is important? Basically, they are a significant share of consumers' bill. Here we can see the breakdown for household and small industrial consumers, the average consumer across Europe. And what we can see in these two graphs is that the network charges are just over a quarter of the bill for consumers. And what is very important is that network charges have been increasing consistently since 2008, on average by 3.3% per year. And we are also expecting them to continue increasing as we are investing in new infrastructure to replace aging one, and as we are modernizing the grids with the installation of automated controls, for example, or monitoring systems to be able to use them in a better way, in a smarter way. The other thing to note here is that the cost for distribution networks are the bulk of the network costs overall. They are about 80%, and the rest 20% is for transmission costs. So what is the structure of network tariffs? What do consumers normally see in their contract or in their bill? Network tariffs normally consist of two components, a fixed component and a volumetric one. And the fixed component can be defined in a number of different ways. The most common ones is that the costs are evenly split between the customers in a certain network. So in this case, we're paying in euros per year, or they can be split according to the size of connection of the consumer with the grid. This is normally called a capacity-based charge, and it's basically the fuse that we have on our meter, or they can be defined by the peak demand, the individual peak demand of a consumer. Most times in Europe, this is independent of when this is happening, and it's measured within a month or within a year. The volumetric component reflects how much the consumer uses. So, for example, if the volumetric component is 1 euro cent per kilowatt hour, and a consumer has used 1,000 kilowatt hours within a certain period, they will pay 10 euros for that. And with that, I will hand over to Andreas that will discuss the principles of smart tariff design.
Thanks, Christos, and hello from my side as well. So the first is regarding the smart tariff design principles I'd like to talk about right here is, why are we talking about all this today? It's simply because it can't wait. And that's first because of a regulatory cycle that takes 4 to 5 years to implement really this as a rollout for every distribution network. And further on, secondly, retailers and aggregators have to adapt these network tariffs to introduce smart tariff products for the end-use customers. And the consumers itself, they have to be educated and experience that's needed as well. So, but by doing so, what can we achieve with smart tariff design? Actually, that is because cables, wires, still have a lot of unused capacity. So, and by doing so with the smart tariff design, we enable the demand side to react to this unused capacity, to use the current infrastructure much better with today's load and even with upcoming new flexible load as electrical vehicles. And by doing so, we empower the consumers to make good decisions to use the infrastructure much better. And of course, last not least, we want to achieve that every consumer should pay the fair share of the jointly used infrastructure. So, but what are the principles we are talking about now? That's first of all, a bill a consumer is facing for the connection to the grid should be based on these connection costs only. And secondly, consumers using more services, of course, they should pay more than others using less of these network services. And the third principle we're considering with all recommendations later on is even consumers with an, let's say, rooftop PV or other generation on site, they use the grid still for backup and for, let's say, frequency services. And these services have costs, and they need to be covered by these consumers too. And after these principles, I hand back for Christos for examples on this.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So basically what Andreas just described boils down in smart tariff designs that recognize how much, when, and where consumers use the grid. The how much is basically volumetric charges. The when is whether a consumer uses the grid at times of scarce capacity on the grid or at times of surplus, and the where it depends on where the consumer is located, whether the consumer is located in an area with high congestion and therefore high costs, high network costs, or in an area with significant excess capacity and therefore lower costs. And smart tariff designs can vary from the simplest form of time of use tariffs. This is probably something that some of you will be aware. You have a different charge depending on whether you're using the grid during the day or during the night. This is what I have at my place. To the most granular ones, which is real-time pricing, and it actually reflects the conditions in the network at the time of use. And this graph here is showing average peak demand reductions for a number of pilots, of a number of smart tariff pilots. Time of use pilots, peak time rebates, critical peak pricing, and just a few real-time pricing pilots. And there are two key conclusions from this graph. The first one is that consumers do respond to prices. You can see across the pilots that significant peak demand reductions have been achieved. And the second one is that smart tariffs work best when they are coupled with smart technology, which is denoted with tech in this graph. And this latter conclusion works the other way around as well. So smart technology maximizes benefits when it is accompanied by smart tariff designs. And while this graph only shows peak demand reductions, it's important to note that smart tariffs more broader can help to shift loads from times of scarcity to times of surplus more broadly. So the first example we're going to discuss today is the Tempo tariff in France. It's a tariff that has been in place for several years, and it's a tariff that has both a critical peak and a time of use component. The critical peak pricing component is depicted by the red bars in this slide, and basically during the 20 days that the system, the grid, is at its tightest, consumers are paying a much higher price for using the system. On the other end, we have the blue days, about 300 days overall in the year, when the system is very comfortable and consumers are paying a much lower price. The time of use component is the split of the 24 hours between a night and a day period. And you can see the note at the bottom of the graph. The day period is between 6 in the morning and 10 p.m. and the night one for the rest of the hours. And what this tariff is doing in effect is that it incentivizes people to move their consumption away from peak hours during red days, and to a lesser extent from day to the night period. And it's been a very successful tariff overall. Significant levels of satisfaction from consumers, and also significant levels of peak demand reduction. And it's worth saying here that RTE, the French TSO, estimates that during the 1990s, tariff-induced demand response peaked at around 6 gigawatt, which is a quite significant amount of demand response. The second example comes from a bit further away. It's from Hawaii, and Hawaii is a very interesting case. The state has set a very ambitious target of a fully decarbonized power sector by 2045, and since 2010 it has seen significant deployment of renewables, mostly solar. It's the state in the US with the highest proportion of solar PVs per household, but also wind and biomass. And it's a very interesting case because Hawaii is not interconnected to any other state. So it's in effect a laboratory for adaptation in a future with high penetration of variable renewables. And this penetration has also brought challenges to the use, to the system and to the grid. And the regulator and the utilities have developed roadmaps about how to address these challenges, and one of the ways they have identified is the development of demand response through dynamic tariff design. And here we can see in this graph a time of use tariff that has been in place in Hawaii since 2014. And I would like to draw your attention to this turquoise block, which basically it's a super off-peak element, and it coincides with the hours of peak solar production. And during these times, consumers are paying much less for using electricity. And what this tariff is doing in effect is that it incentivizes consumers to use electricity during the time to relieve congestion from the grid. And if such a tariff is coupled with new loads, for example, electric vehicles, it can be a very effective way to stop curtailing renewables and at the same time decarbonize the transport sector. And again, it has been a really successful tariff. The take-up of the tariff has exceeded expectations by utilities. So these two examples focused on tariffs that encompass both energy and network costs. And generally speaking, smart network tariffs are still at an early stage of development. However, we do have a few examples across Europe, and here we are going to discuss a couple of them. So the first example comes from Germany, where suppliers and third parties can offer discounted tariffs to controllable loads like heat pumps or electric vehicles in exchange of being able to adjust their demand in case there is a problem on the network. There is stress on the network. And the objective of this tariff is to help with the electrification of the heating sector, the take-up of heat pumps, for example, and to increase network utilization, especially during the night hours that consumption tends to be much lower. And suppliers that have implemented this tariff, they offer a discounted night charge, which can be up to 70% lower than the day charge. The second example comes from Cornwall, and it's called the Sunshine Tariff Pilot. And for those that are not familiar with Cornwall, it's a fairly rural area in Great Britain, and it has a significant deployment of solar PV on the distribution network. And the objective of this pilot was to relieve congestion at times of peak solar production in the summer. So what the companies did there was that they were offering a significantly lower network price during these hours. So between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., the the companies were offering a network charge that was less than 1/3 of the charge for any other hour. And this was, again, like similarly with the case in Hawaii, it was incentivizing consumers to use more consumption during these hours and relieve any congestion on the grid. And with this, we'll pause for a minute for any clarifying questions. The floor is yours, Richard.
Thank you, Christos and Andreas. We do have one initial clarifying question, which is regarding the French tempo tariff and also the numerous pilots that you showed us on the Faruqi slide. The clarifying question is, these two examples, or those two slides, are talking about the total retail tariff faced by the customer and not just the network tariff. Is that correct?
That is correct. They do encompass both energy and network costs. And I'm not sure about any other costs like taxes, but certainly both energy and network.
And so the lesson for us from these slides regarding network tariffs is what?
Well, independent of whether these tariffs include both components, I mean, it's still what the consumer will see at the end of the day is one number. So it's important that all these components are as reflective as possible of the costs that they correspond to. So it's still, all the conclusions that we discussed about around these tariffs are still appropriate and valid for the case of network costs. And considering also that network costs are increasing while actually energy costs are decreasing, it's even more important that the network costs that consumers face are reflective of what are the real costs in the network.
Okay, thanks very much. We have some other questions here, but I'm going to save them for the Q&A session. Please go on.
Thank you, Richard. And next, we're going to discuss the state of play of network charges in Europe. And as mentioned earlier, we're currently investing a lot of money in modernizing our grids, making them smarter. But unfortunately, in many member states, we're seeing a shift towards dumper network tariffs. We're seeing a shift towards fixed charges. So we have a few examples here. The first one comes from Germany, and in Germany, fixed tariffs increased by up to 50% for households between 2013 and 2016, and we'll get into more details in this one in a few slides. The second is Spain. Fixed tariffs again doubled within 2 years in 2013-2014, and now they account for more than 80% of the total network costs. And the last example is from the Netherlands, where the regulator entirely replaced volumetric tariffs that were in place until 2009 with fixed charges only. And it's worth noting here that these all are policy-driven changes. The network cost in Germany did not increase by 50% in 3 years, nor they doubled within 2 years in Spain. And this next graph shows the proportion of fixed fees in network charges for different member states. And on the left-hand side, we have a graph for households across Europe. And on average, households are paying about 30% of their total network charge through fixed fees, although we can see that some member states, some countries are actually paying a lot more through fixed fees. The second example, the second graph is about small industrial consumers, and in this case, the fixed fees amount to about 50% of the total network charges that consumers pay. And in this case, we also have much higher variability across member states. And with this, I'll hand over to Andreas that will describe why fixed tariffs impede the energy transition and are undesirable.
Yeah, once again, thanks, Christos. And I like to continue with this graph. Actually, fixed fees are as an all-you-can-eat buffet. And what you can see as well is that the both guys are paying the same costs, but they are imposing very different costs on the restaurant in this case. And the person on the right is quite unhappy because he's paying the same price even though he's consuming much less. And that's definitely not good for efficiency or fairness. And for the networks, as we are talking about, is that fixed fees harm consumers' engagement, such as we want to see in the energy transition as energy efficiency or demand response. And at the end, it promotes overconsumption, what's leading to excessive costs for all in a restaurant and even on a network. So the fixed fees do not promote efficiency or equity, I said before, and that's because the peak demand on the system, this is important as it determines the size of the grid. And I would like to give you an example how customers use the network jointly, but very different. An example, a church and a shop. They use the network, let's say, with the same peak capacity, but with at very different time slots. So actually they are sharing the network, but they are paying the same, but they are occurring very different peaks on the system. But with the fixed fees, we don't differentiate this customer use of the jointly network. And how does it look like as a field example from Germany? I would like to show you on the next slide with fixed fees. On this graph are the negative effects of the fixed fees visible. So on the horizontal axis, you find the annual consumption of households from 1,000 to 10,000 kilowatt hours per year. And on the vertical axis are the costs per kilowatt hour of the network only. So, and relevant on this screenshot from 2018 of 6 distribution companies or networks we looked at in Germany, from Stuttgart, Wesernet, Edis, Berlin, Envestnet and EWE, is that the only one, Stuttgart, doesn't has a fixed fee and offers even to low usage consumers the fair rate per kilowatt hour, and the others do charge the low usage consumers much more than the higher usage consumers in this case. So this is just a 2018 screenshot, but I want to show you on the next one how it looks, the development over time. So we have in here the data from a specific distribution network operator. From 2014 to 2017, we can see that the cost actually increased for all of them, more in 1 year, less another year, but mostly for the low usage customers by the fixed fees. And on 2017, we see an uplift even for the higher usage consumers, but then to 2018, we do see a shift where the costs per kilowatt hour for the low usage customers increase further, but for the consumers, they consume more, it became cheaper. And that was because they shifted from the volumetric charge to a fixed fee. So, but the question is, what do other industries do? So there's no reason pricing for electricity grid services based on fixed tariffs, because in the long run, all of the costs, even on a network, are variable. So what can we learn from competitive industries, as mentioned in this slide? Even with comparable high capital cost structures, as shown here, oil companies, hotels or airlines, they do recover their costs for investments and operation by products they are selling to their customers. So volumetric only. In fact, that these industries operate in competitive environments while network companies are regulated businesses is not a credible reason to employ economically inefficient prices. In the long run, the network owner need to replace cables, transformers, or even staff too. And this is important to target with the pricing system. So advocates in favor of fixed tariffs argue that network costs don't vary with consumption, and those cost recovery should not be linked to usage. So our answer to this is this should be answered with a smart regulation and with an decoupling, etc., that breaks the links between sales and profits and enables the network operators to implement a smart network tariff design to empower the consumers to achieve the transition targets by lowest costs. So, as you have seen before, the recent trends are worrying because they have the potential to slow down energy transition. Therefore, it's important to start implementing appropriate network tariffs where they are not in place yet. And with this, I come up to our recommendations, which differs by consumer classes. So for the residential consumers, we recommend a volumetric charge only as a default. And if a residential consumer want to pick a more specific tariff, they might use a time of use tariff as well, but just as an optional choice. So for other consumers, new, large, controllable, so new means mainly where the technique is in place with controllable loads, as we heard before, where electrical vehicles belong to as well, there should be a time of use tariff, the default tariff, or even a critical peak, or maybe retail real-time pricing where the smart technology is in place. So, but at the end, that's important that there's not one size fits all, and we have to look where and what are the challenges are to implement the smart tariff design, what fits best to the location challenges. And with this, I hand back to Richard. Thanks.
All right, Christos and Andreas, thank you very much. We have quite a number of questions here, and I'm looking forward to this this Q&A session. Some of them were sent in advance of the session, and several have come in while you've been speaking. And let's begin, Christos, with you. An initial question: what are the experiences with dynamic tariffs?
Experience with dynamic tariffs. There have been a lot of experience with dynamic tariffs, and here we only showed a few examples. There is a lot of experience with dynamic tariffs currently in the US. A lot of states are implementing time of use tariffs, California and other states. And also we are seeing increasingly more experience with dynamic network tariffs. So here we showed a couple of examples from Germany and Cornwall. Just yesterday in a meeting I heard that France has also implemented the dynamic tariff for medium voltage consumers. I know that Portugal was planning to implement, and I don't know if that is in place already, a dynamic network tariff for residential consumers. So there is a lot of experience already, and there is a growing experience on this field.
One detailed question came in concerning the German example. Was that a nationwide tariff, or was it just a pilot in a particular location?
So I think the question was about the nighttime rebates. If this is a lot of distribution network operators do have these rebates. So actually there are 900, nearly 900 distribution network operators in Germany, and my best guess is that a couple of hundreds at least to have these rebates in place, but it doesn't say that they are all used by end-use tariffs where this reduction is in place. So we don't have exact numbers of this, but there was just on the slide Christos showed with the text on, or the ones with the graphs don't have this in there.
Okay, now, and going back to one of your initial observations, can you give any kind of estimate of the amount of unused or spare capacity at the distribution level? And what's the capacity factor as you would look at distribution systems generally?
Thanks, Richard. That's a very good question. We have a slide at the back of the pack. If we can turn to this one. So we've actually looked in a few areas, what is their current utilization rates. And apologies, the left area is not Innogy, it's Envestnet, if I recall correctly. And we've looked what has been their annual, let's say, utilization rate. So what was the actual flow on the network versus the maximum flow on the network. And we've seen that actually there is quite a lot of spare capacity across the year. And what is important to know here is that we've used the maximum flow on these networks, which is very likely an underestimate of what is the capacity of these networks, because we have seen loads of distributed generation connecting to them, so we can assume that some demand is met locally, and when these networks were designed, they were designed without having this in mind, in fact. And we've also looked at what is the utilization rate during the peak days. And again, while the percentages might seem quite high, what we see is that there is a lot of spare capacity between peak hours. Let's say in France, the peak hour lasts for around 2 years, 2 hours in the year that we looked into, 2014. And there was a difference between these peak hours and the off-peak hours of about 13 gigawatt. So a quite significant amount of capacity available on the network at the moment.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. I like to hop on this as well. So as Christos mentioned already, that depends mostly really on the part of the infrastructure of the network. So sometimes it is that in one suburb, maybe the network has a lot of unused capacity, another not. So, and it differs by time and by location very much. And further on, we know that some networks are overbuilt already, or others are extended due to feed in, let's say, from renewables. So they have a lot of spare capacity for the demand side available.
Thank you. But by the way, we received a helpful comment from someone from the Portuguese regulator who clarifies that the dynamic network tariff in Portugal will be implemented for industrial consumers and not residential consumers, and that implementation is expected to start during 2018. Thanks for that information. Now, turning to the residential customers, and to both you, Christos and Andreas, are residential customers really interested in shifting consumption according to short-term price variations? I mean, it takes a lot of energy for people to pay attention to their electricity prices at all, and much less to pay attention over various time periods. So, you know, how do you suggest that we address this question?
It's a very fair question, and as we saw it, I believe it was slide 17 or 18. The there is evidence of residential consumers responding to prices. I mean, this is a fact. Now, that doesn't mean that all consumers want to respond to prices, and broadly speaking, there will be just some consumers that want to respond to prices as the system is at the moment. But what is important to note here is that new technology, automated systems, will make that a lot easier. I can give you an example from my own experience. I have a time of use tariff in my place. I have an electric heating system. I need to control it manually. So every second, third night, I will check, is it hot enough? How can I retain the level of comfort that I want day by day? And absolutely, I mean, you can't expect every residential consumer to be interested in doing that. But on the other hand, automated controls can help to do that in a very easy way. And once smart technology is in place, this is going to, it can explode exponentially, basically, what residential consumers can provide to the system.
So automation is really the answer. It's really what you're saying.
Is one of the answers. I mean, obviously, education is another side that needs to be looked into. So, just putting in place a smart tariff without educating people, it's unlikely to work. You need to provide information. You need to explain to people how to take advantage of tariffs. There is a number of things that need to be looked into. Let's say for smart tariffs to work and residential consumers to respond to them, to respond to the pricing signals that they send.
Thank you. Andreas, how do you think we can realize stronger incentives to increase the flexibility of energy consumers?
Well, yeah, thanks, Rich. I would say first, the most important is to get rid of the wrong incentives. And I would assume in most places we still have wrong incentives in place. So as mentioned before, I know the German situation better than other member states in Europe. So at least I can say in Germany there is it's actually cheaper to consume electricity next to the supply, to the generation, to the windmill. It's more expensive than far away. And that's obviously the wrong incentive by location or by distance. On the other hand, by time of use, what we talked about here mostly is that there are still offers in place for a baseload demand and for industrial customers mainly. So if they are flexible with their load, they face higher network bills. So first of all, to get rid of the wrong ones, then implement the right ones, as mentioned from the network and from the generation as well. And if we have both of them in there, and then let's have a look what else is needed. But let's do one step by another and figure out later on how we can get the consumers into an active role, what's needed in the long run.
All right, now I'd like to take up some really challenging questions to your general premises, beginning with the concern for vulnerable consumers. How do the kind of tariffs that you're talking about, volumetric or dynamic network tariffs, treat vulnerable consumers, and shouldn't we be worried about that?
Thanks, Richard. That's again a very, very good question, and we can turn to the slide with what is happening in Germany with the low usage and high usage consumers. And what we can basically see there is that low usage consumers are paying a lot more in proportion. The previous slide, please. compared to high usage consumers for delivery of electricity to their premises. And broadly speaking, low usage consumers are towards the low end of usage. And what that means is that with fixed tariffs, you're actually penalizing vulnerable consumers. Now, having said that, of course, there are going to be some some energy-intensive vulnerable consumers, so some consumers that will be on the right side of this graph. And we believe that in order to address the problem in this case, so vulnerable consumers that are living in energy inefficient houses, the best way is to develop energy efficiency programs that are targeted to this kind of consumers. An example of that is from Great Britain, for example. There was a program that was targeting exclusively vulnerable consumers. So you're addressing the problem from the root instead of the symptoms, let's say. And in fairness, energy efficiency might take, a year or two to be in place. In that case, if there is a need for help to vulnerable consumers, you can offer some sort of credit. It's let's say, undesirable to subsidize this kind of consumers directly through the tariffs. It's better that they can see the full cost of use of consumption, and then if there is a need in the short term, in the near term, you can put in place some safeguard for them. And the other thing I would also add on this is that by moving from fixed to volumetric and smart tariffs, we are basically lowering the cost for everyone. And that is a very key point. We are making best use of the networks that we currently have. We are minimizing investments for the future. So everybody's benefiting from that change. And this is the same for vulnerable consumers and all other consumers.
Okay, now a question, a fundamental question for Andreas, I think. You have stated that getting the network tariffs right is important to supporting the transition to a clean energy system, and that getting it wrong will slow down the transition. Can you explain why you make that statement, and does it have anything to do with the move towards electrification of vehicles and heat pumps for buildings?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So indeed, this is a good and a broad question. So as mentioned before, so the networks are not fully utilized, and the demand on electricity probably is increasing over time when we electrify the transport and heating sector, because we want to decarbonize this demand as well. So we will face additional load on the existing infrastructure. So, but the supply will become more and more variable from variable renewables mainly, and this case. And the question is, how can we use it, and how can we use these supply resources in a smart way with the existing infrastructure? Of course, we might to add new investments here and there, but it should be limited to the consumer benefits by minimizing these investments. So, and if we are able to incentivize the consumers to shift this new demand to these time slots and to these locations mostly where the infrastructure is already in place, and this can be even from let's say a feed in from a rooftop PV, what can be used then by the neighbors, and incentivizing by a smart tariff design. By doing so, we can drive the transition further. By not doing so we might penalize these distributed resources and harm the transition because we put more costs on these private clean investments as it is necessary. So, but that's probably the tricky point, because as mentioned, it's not that the one size fits all. So we have to figure out what's needed here and there, and that's probably, let's say, for an very urban network, a different setup in the long run than for a rural network, where much more feed-in takes place and where other demand is on the network, as in downtown, where not a lot of feed-in is, but maybe a lot of flexibility on the demand side. I hope that answer this question.
Well, let me turn to the even thornier question now, which is a reminder from a number of people that that in the short run anyway, it looks like the costs of a distribution system are largely fixed costs, and then the argument flows from that in a regulated environment, that fixed costs should be recovered in fixed charges, and that's just the economically proper thing to do. You're obviously recommending something quite different, so please explain why.
Of course, it's the most easy way, as you say, to recover fixed costs by fixed fees. But that's definitely not the smart way, and not what we learn from competitive industries. Actually, they do it much smarter, and this is what we should adapt with the regulated infrastructure as well, to use this smart tariff design to charge the customers when there is a congestion, when there is a peak demand, to say, hey, we charge you more and we guide you to the time slots or to the locations where we have a lot of capacity available. And this is what we can actually learn from competitive industries, and this should be adapted by the regulated setups and tariff design as well, to guide the people there. And because of all of these, as it looks like, investment costs are fixed, it is not true. In the long run, we have to talk by investments, and we can influence these investments, and we can lower these investments, and all consumers can benefit from these lower investments if we do it in a smart way.
Well, you just mentioned two things that have also come up in some of the questions. Location and relationship to the energy market. So let's take them separately. Let's talk about the relationship to the energy market generally. It's not necessarily the case that the peak demand or congestion on a distribution network will coincide with the peak period in an energy market. And so you have, on the one hand, distribution companies that are trying to manage their grids, and if they accept your advice and try to minimize congestion. And then on the other hand, you have balancing responsible parties who are dealing with their responsibilities to the system. And you have prices in energy markets that are varying quite differently from what may be going on the distribution system. How do you answer the question that, well, these things aren't connected up, and therefore we should just treat distribution tariffs totally separately?
That's indeed a very tricky question, and the answer even more. Yeah, because there's not a link by nature between the energy and the network at itself. It can be, or it could be, but it doesn't have to be. So yeah, indeed, we have to treat it first separately when there's congestion. If there's not real congestion on the network, that's not so crucial. But in the long run, yeah, probably the best would be a bi-directional network charge that differs by location and time. But this is very theoretical at the end, and it's probably not needed everywhere, even not in the long run. But this has to be figured out where this is needed, and then the market has to deal with and to create products and offer to customers to match these network signals with the power market signals, and that consumers can respond to these signals or to use these products. This is probably then at the end different, that we do see different products, let's say in the countryside, and then really for a downtown supermarket.
All right, thank you. This is obviously thorny, and I know you've got some answers. We're excited to see that there's so many questions coming in, and we'd like to answer as many as possible in this live session. So on the other hand, we realize that some people may have just booked 1 hour for this session. So what I'd like to do now is hand the mic back to Christos and Andreas to provide us with their conclusions and parting thoughts, and then we will come back to the live session to take up some additional questions for up to an additional half hour. So back to you, Christos and Andreas.
Thanks, Richard, and could we move to the previous slide? Actually, that's great. So very briefly, what we have discussed today, what are the key conclusions from this presentation? The first one is that tariff design is an integral part of public policy goals that should support and not impede the energy transition. And smart network tariffs can actually do that. They can empower consumers to take the right action, for example, by investing in the right technologies or by shifting their load by doing energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. And the third point is that smart tariffs can also help to optimize the use of the networks that we have at the moment, and also minimize what we need to invest into in the future, thus lowering the cost for everyone, benefiting everyone across the entire system. And can we also move to the resources slide? For everyone's benefit, we also have a list of resources from RAP in the slide pack that will become available in a day or so, and you can find all sorts of reports and publications related to the topic of tariff design, from network tariff design to designing tariffs for distributed generation, and so on. And with that, I will hand back to you, Richard.
All right, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for participating in this webinar. As I said, we have quite a number of questions, and we're prepared to continue discussing them for the next 30 minutes or so. One question that came in is this question about the relationship between dynamic energy tariffs and dynamic network tariffs. And I guess I'm going to go back to basics a little bit here and ask you, are you proposing that what we need to do is jump to dynamic network tariffs, or simply that time of use and volumetric tariffs are better than fixed charges?
I can answer that question. I mean, if the person means by dynamic tariffs real-time pricing, which is, let's say, the most advanced type of dynamic tariff, no, this is not what we are suggesting. The choice of tariff should be linked to what is going to be its likely benefit. So if, let's say, in a market now you have fixed tariffs or you have only volumetric tariffs, going directly to the last to the most advanced tariff is not going to be likely effective, and it's more likely actually to be pretty ineffective and get a lot of people angry because they won't know how to use this kind of tariffs. Plus, there's not the technology in a lot of places to go to this kind of tariffs. So what we are suggesting is that in any case, the present reality should be taken into account. For residential consumers, we think that tariffs should be volumetric by default, and for consumers that want something more advanced, there should be the option of time of use tariffs. This is in place in many places across Europe. My parents in Greece have a tariff like that. I have a tariff like that. It changes between day and night. It's very easy, and consumers do get it and they do respond to it. And for controllable loads like electric vehicles, new controllable loads, EVs, heat pumps, they can add a lot of new demand on the grid. We are suggesting that we do go to time of use tariffs by default, because if we don't do that, if we just have a fixed charge or a flat rate across the day, it is not a very good incentive for taking up this kind of tariffs, this kind of loads, excuse me. So our recommendation in this case is that time of use tariffs are the default choice, and the more smart technology we have in the network, critical peak pricing could also be a very good option. You really don't want to start charging your EV car when the grid is at its tightest, especially since there is a lot of spare capacity of surplus at other times during the day.
As in the Hawaii example.
Exactly.
So,
and
Andreas?
So, yeah, I would like to add to this what you mentioned before. What is better than have fixed fees in there is even in that case a flat volumetric tariff. Let's think about all the little apartments we do have in Europe. Millions of people do live in an apartment where they don't have any flexibility, so they just run their TV and their fridge on the system, and it's better to have a volumetric tariff for them to use their electricity efficient instead of a fixed fee where they can't save. So it's better to have this and then to get to the next step as in time of use tariff. But a fixed fee is definitely the worst of all.
How would you answer a network operator asking for higher fixed tariffs because the amount of energy distributed today is decreasing due to self-consumption? So distribution companies are facing some problems with reduced consumption in certain places, and they're asking for fixed costs for the security of investment. How do we deal with their legitimate needs?
Well, first of all, I would say, as mentioned within the slides as well, a decoupling that's in place of the most European member states, decoupling from throughput for the network operators. It doesn't have to harm their revenues. Even if there is a lower consumption on their network, they can charge later on to recover their costs. So it's not a risk for the network operators. But regarding to the mentioned self-consumption, it is probably in the most places not very crucial what we are talking about, because it is that some are able to produce a few kilowatt hours and replacing this electricity by what they are taking from the grid normally. But as mentioned earlier, we are adding new demand to the network, so from electrical vehicles, etc. So it's probably not that the demand on the network is decreasing totally. It might decrease in some regions, and this is where it's becoming very critical. We can talk about what other solutions might be needed, but we haven't seen so far in the world that it's really a threat for the network operators yet.
All right, thanks very much. So let's bear down a little bit more on self-consumption question. What do you recommend as the best network tariff design for self-consumption or prosumer consumers? Is there, I mean, we've been talking mostly about the consumption side of this equation and not the production side. So what about the production side? What should the tariff look like for them?
Here as well, it's probably that we do need different solutions for different locations, but in general it is that even for the feed-in from these customers, this has a value, and this value should become visible to these producers, or but if in case of network congestion, maybe there is no value or even a negative value if they want to feed in and the network operator has to, let's say, replace the substation because of this single kilowatt hour what has to be fed in by a rooftop PV. Then there are of course related costs for the grid extension, and these need to be considered as well, and has to be, let's say, shared or paid by these prosumers when they use the grid by this direction. So at the end, of course, it's a question as well, is there already a support on the PV investment, and should be there an additional support from the network for these customers? All these things need to be considered to set up the right tariff for the feed-in, but this is not coupled directly to the demand of these customers. So this can be charged different, or probably it need to be charged different in the long run, but that's probably not needed in the most cases yet.
Now a question for either of you. Should final customers bear all network costs, or should generators pay for them as well, or pay for part of them as well? Is this something that you've considered as part of this work?
At the end, consumers will face the bill, whether even if you put some of these network costs on generators, that will just mean that they will sell their product at a higher price. So consumers will always pay for the network costs, and that has been the case since electricity was developed, basically. It doesn't really matter how you split them, or initially, at the end, the bill will be shared by consumers.
Yeah, I agree to that what Christos said. Of course, at the end consumer has to pay the entire cost of the system, but maybe due to the energy transition and of the distributed energy resources and generation we are facing with the transition, it's becoming more tricky. So maybe we do need at least instruments to guide the investments on the supply side to the right location. And we might need incentives on, let's say, the wholesale and transmission level for that, but maybe as well on the distribution. So there are very experience on that, how these can be achieved, but this can be done by regulation, by incentives, or maybe even by markets. So, but we are not there yet to have an, let's say, final conclusion if there's one solution that fits all.
Well, certainly in some places with with market splitting and locational or zonal pricing in wholesale power markets, the price signal can be given to generators about where they should locate, which is sending the price signal through the energy market rather than through the transmission grid.
Of course, that's true, but in Europe we don't have. We have zonal pricing in some regions of Europe, but in most member states we have simply national bidding zones, what don't incentivize the supply to settle at the best place regarding to the energy system, maybe just regarding political willness. And yeah, therefore we are not there.
That's fine. That was sort of a digression from the topic of the day, but it does relate to the use of the network. So now to return to a question from one of our listeners, Andreas, I'm giving this to you at first because you had the all-you-can-eat buffet slide where two customers who consume quite different amounts might be paying the same fixed charge if charges are fixed. And now we have there's a parallel to that one though. Imagine two households each using, for example, 3,000 kilowatt hours a year, but one has a peak demand of twice the other. Why is it fair if we go to pure volumetric pricing that they would pay the same for the use of the network?
Pure volumetric might not be that fair in this case, but with the time of use tariff, it's that fits much more. But if there's no congestion on the system, on the distribution network, we don't have to care about the double peak of one compared to the other, and it might just differ by, let's say, power prices, but not by network congestions if there is no congestion and a lot of unused capacity available. So that's in this case simply not needed, and by keeping volumetric prices we still give an incentive to both households to deal efficient with their consumption and to invest into, let's say, a new fridge, etc., to reduce their consumption. But as mentioned, a fixed fee will disincentivize all these efficiency investments in both households. So therefore a volumetric helps all customers in the long run.
So you're saying, let me ask an additional question, and Christos, you could chime in here too. You're saying that the network charges, the network rate design should be created in such a way that it encourages end-use energy efficiency. And why wouldn't we just rely on either taxation policy or on energy market prices to drive efficiency instead of using network tariff design to drive efficiency?
Christoph, you're first.
I will give this one to you, Andreas.
Okay. Well, we have the option to use the regulated network to lower the bills of all connected consumers. So I would say there is no reason to give this option out of our hand. We have to use it and to minimize costs. And this is, of course, in the long run, the networks. And we know if all the additional load, what probably is coming online, electrical vehicles, if they are charged by, when the people coming home all plugged in and charged in once, we have to invest billions into the network. But with the smart tariff design, we probably will be able to avoid most or maybe even all of these investment what would be needed if we don't do. So there is a chance, and we should use the chance, and we shouldn't wait for what the bill looks like if we don't use this chance.
So we're not really relying on network tariffs, which are a relatively small fraction of the bill, to drive energy efficiency. We're just creating a network tariff that doesn't penalize efficiency. Is that what you're saying?
It shouldn't penalize, but if it's volumetric, we do, let's say, of course, incentivize as well. So it's, as Christos mentioned, it's a quarter of the consumer bills, the network tariffs. So, and that, of course, it matters. So if this part is moved out of your volumetric bill, so you will disincentivize your energy efficient investments by a quarter. So let's stick to that setup and give it this chance back to the consumers to replace their light bulbs and inefficient TVs, whatever.
Christos, anything to add on that one?
Oh, I totally agree with Andreas' answer. It is important for network tariffs to be volumetric so that it also incentivizes energy efficiency. And you know, if you put a fixed charge and it disincentivizes energy efficiency, you'll have to pay for it in some other way. You have overconsumption, broadly speaking, and less energy efficiency, more cost for everyone.
Well, there is the question, and maybe you can answer this in sort of the going back to your principles of rate design. There is the question whether the network tariff should be designed solely towards the efficient allocation of network costs alone, or whether it should be designed with an eye to broader social policies, such as the promoting energy efficiency, promoting the use of electric vehicles, and otherwise assisting the transition. How do you answer the concern that network tariff design should only focus on the efficient allocation of network costs, and that's it?
So
I think, sorry, go ahead, Andreas.
Yes, please, Christos, go you ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Andreas. I mean, I think what we've discussed in today's webinar is actually achieving both goals. Is achieving an efficient use of the network, and at the same time it helps to achieve the energy union transition goals. So I'm thinking now the example of Hawaii. You know, it has set an ambitious target for a cleaner system, clean power sector, clean transportation, and what you're doing with the tariff in Hawaii, you're actually incentivizing people to use the grid at the right times, to relieve any congestion from the grid, and at the same time you're achieving your clean, your lower emission targets. So I don't see them as separate as the question suggested, but maybe Andreas or you, Richard, have something to add on this.
Well, I would like to add, of course, the networks are part of the power system, and of course, when we are talking about the costs of the network, they should be allocated in an efficient way. We shouldn't forget the entire costs of the system, and therefore we have to compare both, and in this case the both signals, to minimize the system costs at the end. And if the network costs are still or network, maybe even investments, are the cheapest solution for the entire system, we should invest into the the copper cables and wires before we implement more supply resources what we would need without these investments into the network. So of course it has to be considered both, because it's just the service between the supply and the demand.
All right, thanks very much, and thanks to our listeners for all the really good, challenging, and informative questions. I think at this point it's time to end the webinar, and I guess I would turn it back to Christos and Andreas for any final questions or comments that they would like to make. And as to all of the listeners who are still with us, as you exit the webinar, you'll see 3 survey questions appearing, and we'd be really grateful if you could take a moment to provide us with very brief feedback on them. And watch your email. We will be sending links to a recording of the webinar and the slide deck to all the registrants. Thanks very much. Any final words from you guys?
Nothing other than thanks to everyone for listening in.
All right.
And should you have any further questions, just do not hesitate to get in touch.
All right. Thanks very much, Christos and Andreas. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.